Hi, I'm Georgie Dickens, host of Stratospheric Leaders, the podcast where I get to have inspired conversations with extraordinary leaders from across capital markets. Join me to hear their game-changing strategies, the personal stories and powerful sound bites behind their stratospheric success. Every episode packed with wisdom, insight and real-world lessons, the stuff they simply don't teach you in business school. If you want to elevate your game and most importantly, those around you, this podcast is for you. Enjoy. Today, I have the extraordinary privilege of speaking with Sharon Bowen, Chair of the Board of Directors of the New York Stock Exchange. And Sharon is the first African-American woman to hold this position in the institution's 230-year history, as well as currently serving on several regulated boards. And I, Sharon, have been very much looking forward to our conversation because several months ago, you and I met and you had such vibrancy, and that vibrancy came through in the beautiful fuchsia pink dress you were wearing, but also it came through in your warmth, in your energy. And I left thinking, this is an individual that isn't just reshaping capital markets, but this is a person who's changing the landscape of the world. Because I always think it takes individuals that create revolutions. And I left having this such a positive, I left inspired. And I think every interaction any of us have creates an echo. And I left that interaction feeling so upbeat and yet just so moved. And when we think about your influence, it wasn't just in the room, because you have had over 35 years in many positions, regulatory, securities, you have public policy expertise, starting your career in law to serving as a commissioner of the CFTC during one of the most critical periods in modern financial history, to now guiding the New York Stock Exchange. I think we can look around us and we can both agree it's one of the world is going through extreme change, but also that brings with it, incredible opportunity. You are a respected voice to many, many CEOs, and I look forward to hearing your lessons today. And equally, I feel very privileged that I get the opportunity to amplify those messages with my community. So thank you, Sharon, for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for those kind words, Georgie. And let me just say on the energy level, when you left the room, I was energized as well, as you know, and I think we reflect off of each other. I think, kindred spirits, which I kind of think we are, in many respects. We kind of want the same things. We look at the world, I think, in similar ways. And I want to congratulate you on your podcast and being a voice, bringing excellence to leadership, being a trusted advisor, and it's so needed today. So congratulations on the great work you're doing as well.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I received that. So thank you so much for that, Sharon. And I want to start from the beginning because children often daydream. I look at my two boys who are 15 and 13, and they spend time daydreaming. And that isn't childish. It's kind of childlike. They come at the world through curiosity and wonder. And I wonder, when you reflect back on yourself as a child, what did you dream? When you were daydreaming, what did you dream of becoming when you grew, the grown-up?
Yeah. Well, just a little brief about my background. So, I was the youngest of 5 children. I grew up in segregated Virginia, attended an all-Black elementary school, and had the same teachers that my brothers and sisters had. And it was during a time when my parents and neighbors and community were fighting for, the opportunity for me to go to schools that were integrated. And that happened during my 8th grade year. But so talk about dreaming, one of the things that happened early on was I became an avid reader, like really early on. My brother was 3 years older and I wanted to do everything that he could do. So, when he was 6, so at 3, I wanted to read and I wanted to write, and I was able to learn how to do both at a really early age. So by the time I started school, I had the opportunity to pretty much read every book in the library. And one of my favorite characters then was Nancy Drew. So I think in growing up, I thought I could be, an investigator like Nancy Drew, maybe. I certainly thought, more realistically, there were so many teachers that I really respected. So, and pretty much in my community, there weren't that many opportunities for young, Black women to even think about corporate America. So, education was also important. So being a teacher would have been a great career too.
I love that. And that you said being an avid reader. When I look at great leaders, they're voracious learners. They always recognize there's something to learn. And I think they also recognize they can learn from anyone in the room.
Absolutely.
Sometimes our best teachings can come from children, or it can come from the janitor. Like, you never know where those valuable lessons can come from. So I think it's that openness
Yeah.
to receiving and openness to knowing what we don't know.
No, you're right. And that sense of curiosity, you mentioned your children. I mean, I think that sense of curiosity, if you can maintain that throughout your career, I think you'll continue to grow and to succeed. I think that's key.
Yeah. It's interesting because when my children were little, so quizzical, why does it work that way? Always asking questions. And as a parent, sometimes you could be like, enough with the questions. And actually you recognize, that actually they're learning, they're
Yes.
evolving, and they're growing. And you talked about that. I've got two brothers, but you talked about, you compared yourself with your brother. And I think it's often, if we're comparing ourselves with others, and it's healthy comparison, that pushes us to raise our bar like every day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It really does.
And look, so we talked about, so a teacher would have been, a role that, when you were younger, or an investigator. What was your first ever paid job? Your first job, or it might not have been paid, but first ever job you can recall.
So somewhat in the same vein of thought. So it wasn't a paying job, but one of the things the teacher did when I was in elementary school, I was disrupting the classes because I was a little bit bored. So they came up with the solution. I would do all of my work before lunch, and then after lunch, I would work in the library and help to restock books. And it was really through that first non-paying job that I got introduced to reading. And so it wasn't a paying job, in the sense, but I took that role very seriously and made sure the books were lined up, properly and in the right order. But other than that, obviously, babysitting, at a young age was probably the first, real paying job, if you want to call that a job.
It is a big job. You've got to keep people alive and safe and well and hydrated. It's interesting with libraries. My brother years ago bought me a Kindle. I still love a book. There is still something for me about turning a page, the smell of a book. I like to write in books. I can't move to electronic books. And I love going into a library. I love going into a bookstore. There is something about books that I think there's so much magic.
Yeah. It's funny, one of my sisters was a librarian, so I think it's sort of that there's through osmosis that I like books too. I do both. I have hard copies. I have, on my digital as well, on my iPad. So I can do both now.
Well, look, when I was spending time kind of researching for today, you talk about mentors, you talk about mentees, and I was just curious, if we use that word curious, I was curious in terms of the arc of your career. Who have been some of your mentors, and what specifically did they teach you that stayed with you?
So I often tell people, like, thank God I still have mentors today, but it started right in my own family. Probably started with my parents, my grandmother at a really young age, who really, impressed upon me. And then that my mentors probably grew as I grew to peers and people in my community. And then obviously as I progressed through academia, professors, classmates. When I started my career on Wall Street, I had a lot of mentors. I was really, really fortunate at a really early part of my career to have like great teachers and great mentors. I think what I learned from them was two things. One of them was early on the real importance of giving back. So often I'll tell people who ask me, how can I find a good mentor? I say, mentor someone. That's the best way to find a mentor. It's, for you yourself to to be a mentor and to give back to someone else. I think I also learned from, my mentees that it's okay to ask for help. Often we try to figure out if we can figure it out on our own, and there's no reason to try to do that or reinvent the wheel. So I learned from my mentees, you don't have to start from scratch. You can learn from others. As a lawyer, it was the concept of precedent. So when you started to draft that next underwriting agreement, you didn't have to start from scratch. You could go to the first and the second and the third underwriting agreement you drafted before. And so the fact that you can look to other places for help and to ask for help, I think that was probably one of the biggest kernels that I really gained from my mentors, to be honest with you.
I love that. Not starting from scratch and leveraging the people around you, and
Yes.
that giving back. And I don't mean this in the crudest way, but it's the give to get, because I believe in the law of attraction. If we put good things out in the world, that comes back at us in different ways, and sometimes really
Yes.
ways we would never imagine. But it's doing it coming from a place of service.
It does. And I can point to many times in my careers where that important phone call, that important client was someone I had mentored. And so I always tell people, your mentor could be your classmate, the person you're seated next to. That person could be your boss the next day, could be the chair of your company the next day. And so the give to get, it happens organically, I think. And, we're fortunate if that's a magical thing when it does happen.
I sometimes hear people saying to me about they recognize the importance of having, mentors around them, because however senior you are, there's always room for growth.
Absolutely.
And room to have people be the mirror to give you advice. And some people are like, I haven't got time. So I'm curious, when you think about your mentors, were they ones you actively cultivated, or are they people who came to you organically, who are like, Sharon, I would love to offer you some advice? I suppose that's where my thinking took me.
Yeah, I think organically. And I'm often asked, like, will you mentor me? And that's always sort of a hard thing, because it does require time. But sometimes it does require asking, and often I tell people that I sort of gained the respect of my mentors by working for them and being the best I could be at the work that I did for them. And so they saw in me that sense of curiosity, the sense that I wanted to be the best I could be. And so when people see you doing that, it's a natural instinct, I think, to want to help that person, right? When you see someone who is out there putting their all into being the best that they can be, I think it's a natural tendency to say, what can I do? What can I do to help that person?
Yeah.
We really do.
Yeah. And I think when people offer that help, it's because they see something in you. And
Yes.
actually your success becomes their success as well, because you can help amplify and maybe see what they can't yet see in themselves.
It's interesting you say that, because when I'm asked that question, in terms of either my legacy or what am I most proud of, one of my responses is, seeing my mentees grow and evolve and be leaders. And so many of them have been extremely successful. I'm just so proud of them and the little role that I played. And often we don't know what that little role may have been, or that one thing that you said that resonated with that person. You just never know sometimes.
I remember one of my mentors once sharing with me, he said a single insight can shift everything. And it's so true. It's like you could read a book, and one sentence in a book, it moves your thinking. I suppose life is all about the sliding doors and different pathways, and you never know where those inflection points come. And sometimes that's in the form of advice.
Yeah. But then, you're that kind of person too, Georgia, where you're open and you're receptive to that, right? So I think part of it too is being open and receptive. And again, that's part of being willing to say, I need help, or, I can't figure this out, or, how'd you navigate, that sense of curiosity? How did you navigate that? Like, how did you, it's funny when I'm asked, like, how did I get this job? Like, how did I get to become chair of the New York Stock Exchange? And it's, people think there's a path somehow, a single one way. And as you know, there's no one way and there's no one route.
Yeah.
Yeah. It really isn't.
No. And it will look it looks different for everyone.
It is.
Everyone has a different pathway, and there's a different different factors that have played a part in that. And we talk about mentors, and you also speak about the importance of being a mentee. And what have you learned about yourself? Because, we all have we all have truth tellers around us. It's whether we are open, as you just shared, and receptive to hearing what they have to share. But yeah, what have you learned about yourself?
I like myself. I've learned to like myself, which I have. I've learned that the self-confidence that I have really came from my background and the way that I was raised. So, people looked at me and they said, Sharon, you're always confident. And part of that is, believing that I could be anything that I wanted to be, because I was sort of raised that way. And now I try to instill that into my mentees, so like think big, think big. And I learned that thinking big has its rewards. It really does. And my mentees also, I think, have taught me the importance of showing up, being there for each other. And that takes, being intentional about that, showing up for those points that really can make a difference to someone. Just being there makes a difference. It really does.
Yeah. The Believe, I don't know if you've watched Ted Lasso. Have you watched Ted Lasso
I have.
on TV?
Yes, I have.
Yes. And they have the sign, Believe, that they all, before they go for a match, they all kind of high five the sign.
Yes.
And it's just that constant reminder, believe in yourself. And validation is an inside job, isn't it? We
It
can
is.
have people that believe in us, but we have to cultivate that ourselves. And I love what you said, I like myself. And I think how many of us look in the mirror and see our foibles and flaws,
Right.
rather than look in the mirror and be like, I like myself. I love myself.
Well, but at the same time, I can work on myself too, though. Don't get me wrong. I see the flaws there too, then the warts and all that. So it's a work. I'm a work in progress at the same time.
No, we all, and you said the think big. And one of my clients, he talks about, I think it's back in the 80s, they had the BHAGs, the big, hairy, audacious goals. And it was like dream big. And he goes, why dream for the moonshot goal when Mars mission was possible? So it is that anything, and I speak to my children and my mentees, like anything is possible, is possible, but you got to believe.
Well, not only that, you don't know what the future is. You really don't. And, the things that exist today, there's no way I could have imagined any of that. There's just no way I can imagine. I'm actually just right above the floor of the New York Stock Exchange as we speak. And, the first time I ever set foot in this building was as a summer intern. And that was in the day before electronic trading. It was a floor full of men in different colored jackets, screaming orders at each other and, paper all over the floor. And, who would have thought that, some years later to walk in this door, as a chair really is a special opportunity. It really is.
Yeah. Whenever I step into the New York, we talk about energy. Whenever I step into the New York Stock Exchange, it just radiates.
It does.
The most extraordinary energy. And you feel part of something special.
Yes.
You really and everyone who's there is happy because there's IPOs, there's celebrations. There's very few places where you go where it's just it's a bubble of happiness and joy.
Yeah, which is why I love to come. I really do. And we've got, obviously Lynn Martin, the president, is doing a great job leading, the stock exchange, and she's got an incredible, management team, and we've got the best event staff, in the world. They, as you know, the opening bell and the closing bell. So twice a day, we're hosting someone who's either raising capital to create jobs or innovation, to celebrating milestones, to having. I get a lot of joy when I see students on the floor and have the opportunity to just talk to them about it. I just got an email from someone who had bought a group of students, and she said to me in the email, like, one of the students said he wanted to be a stockbroker. He didn't even know about what a stockbroker even was until he came to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. So you never know sometimes sort of just being present and just that image, what that can mean. And Again, it's that visibility for me is important when I can inspire that next generation, especially.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to ring the New York Stock Exchange bell back in March, and it was such an out of body experience
Yeah.
because it was such an out of body experience. And subsequently, there's the CEO, Sandeep from Clearwater Analytics, and when I interviewed him, he talked about what the bell meant to his team.
Mm.
They IPO'd, they're a team from Idaho, and he said, look, it's that word believe. It just fueled us in a way. And it was such a humbling, when you listen to him speak about that moment, that's something that'll live with him and his team forever.
Yeah.
Like it was a moment.
Yeah.
And the New York Stock Exchange creates moments and memories for people.
It does. And I'm so happy to be part of that. I always come in here smiling. I walk out smiling even bigger. It's an exciting place. It really is. And what we do is important, to our economy and to companies and for job creation and growth, and innovation. And so, being a part of that engine that fuels, the future, it's how can you not be happy about being a part of that? Right.
No, I think, I said, there's very few places that radiate such happiness. And we talked about mentors, but and also you advocate for having a board of directors the same way that a Coca-Cola or a BMW has a board of directors. And mentorship is one role on the board. Like, what other roles have people on your board played for you? I'm just curious around that.
Yeah, and again, that's evolved. Like my mentors, some of my mentors are on my personal board of directors, and some are. Mentors are people who kind of really know me intimately. Some members of my board of directors know me, personally, intimately, but many of them know me professionally and, as well. And so normally when I try to tap into my board of directors, it's a great diverse group of people. It's across industries. It could be someone who's a starving artist, or, it could be someone who's created a company. It's just former CEOs. It's a broad spectrum across age groups, races, gender. It really spans, the breadth, which is important. I kind of learned, particularly as a regulator, how important it was just to have diverse perspectives in making decisions. And also, sometimes my board has said to me, like, I said, I've been offered this opportunity. What do you think? And I remember one of my members of my board of directors, he said, you know what, I think you should hold out for something better. Or someone said, I got offered this, the mayor wanted me to do X. And one of my board of directors said, Sharon, I think you can better use your skill set doing Y. So go back to them and tell them that you want to do Y instead. And then that happened. So they're a sounding board, and they run, again, across industries and age groups and all that, which is great. And they've evolved, with time as well. Yeah, but I continue to have fun.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But that's that diverse group you mentioned. I think it's really important, that word diverse, because we don't want to be in an echo chamber. If everyone's giving us the same advice, then that diversity of perspective and that sounding board, because when we're thinking things through, we can't possibly be the most objective person when it's us. So having those sounding boards is so important.
Absolutely. And then you'd learn, by having my board of directors, I learned to be a better sounding board, again, for my mentees and friends, because then I can grow sort of that muscle of knowing what it means to not know what the right answer is, and not only just be more empathetic, but, being more authentic and saying to someone, I kind of know what that feels like, because I too had that crossroads in my career trying to figure out, like, do I say yes? Do I say no?
It's when I think about sounding boards, I think of the importance of listening. And I remember someone, I can't remember who it was, shared that listening is such a luxury these days. And it's like, be someone's luxury, because we're often in that world of constant throughput, go, go, go. And actually having people who will truly listen, like, 2 ears, 1 mouth. And yet I think we're often we can find ourselves but to have people who truly listen is such a gift.
It is. I mean, I in my opinion, when I look at particularly the CEOs of the companies on whose board I sit, they're great listeners. They really are. I mean, I think it's a hallmark of a great leader, and it's definitely the hallmark of someone who created something from scratch. The real entrepreneur who's like built a company. They were great listeners, and that's something I've learned from my board of directors. I've learned from observing others that that's a great muscle to have, and I learned so much from just listening. Because when you hear people and validate what they're saying, it makes such a huge difference. Not just to that person, but to bring that, to amplify that message, for that person. When I say, I think I'm hearing you say X, and is that what you're saying? And so I've done that often in my boards, including yesterday on one of my board calls. Like I had heard someone raise a point, and I heard someone else answer the question, but it wasn't really his question. And I said, I don't think that was what, he had in mind. So I said, John, was that really what you were saying? What I was hearing was X. And so, being a good listener also helps you to amplify other people's messages as well. You probably know that.
What you heard is...
Yes.
Yes. I do. And when you play things back, you're like, well, did I interpret it correctly? Because sometimes people initially say something and they don't exactly mean what they say. But when they hear their words back, they're like, no, actually, what I meant was...
We need that, and we need that even more so, particularly when we see people communicate, vis-a-vis email and through digital means. And I tell pick up the phone, have a conversation. You really can't have a conversation by text. You really can't. The nuances of, having, the voice, hearing the person's tone, hearing the excitement, hearing the fear, hearing the trepidation. And you can't read that in a text. And that's such a great, which means you're missing half the picture if you can't see the picture. And that's just really important.
It's all the silent messaging, isn't it? The non-verbals, that are just not privy when it's a text or and you'll have a word that will mean something to you. Whereas, like if I said, did you finish? Yeah, you're going to finish that sentence. That I might mean like words. You might mean like a prison sentence. We have a different understanding. And so hence that collective understanding. And there was a leader I worked with, and he talked about the importance of listening, where he said, as leaders, we influence the room, and he said that before everyone knows where I stand, I want to know where they sit. So your point where you said there, I just take a step back to listen, because it's when you listen, you hear that perspective. Whereas if you speak sometimes as the leader first, you can lead the conversation in a certain direction.
Absolutely. And often you don't make the best decisions. I mean, again, one of the things I learned as a regulator, I didn't know all the answers, and coming out of the financial crisis, especially the effects of rulemaking on the industry. And it was just so important to me to make sure I brought in the perspectives of, market participants in academia and people from the public interest groups, and to hear everyone's perspective. And so that was part of my hallmark, partly because I knew how complicated our markets are. And I knew that to try to help solve for not having another financial crisis, I needed to understand how we got there and who got harmed and why. And what could I do in my seat to, be the voice of that everyday person who had been affected, who didn't have a seat at the table. And so I've always said to people, you need to have a seat at the table, but you bring with you other people's experiences, which means you really, you have to be open to hearing from others as well.
Yeah. And you have a responsibility to the seat you sit in, don't you, to be representative?
Absolutely.
Of the voice of others.
Absolutely.
In my introduction, I spoke about you being the first the African American chair of the New York Stock Exchange Board of Directors, and your career has been marked by many firsts, like many firsts. And I just talked about the word responsibility, and I think, how do you think about the responsibility of being a first, being that role model that others look up to?
Well, first, I acknowledge it's a great honor and privilege to be a first. I mean, it really is. So I don't really see it as a quote responsibility in that sense. It's an honor. It typically is a recognition of something I've done in the past, and someone seeing my ability to move that needle even more in the future. And then I reflect upon like the people who paved the way. Like, being a first doesn't mean that someone didn't come before you to kind of pave the way. And I know that, from my historical background, that, I didn't get that seat at the table because I was the smartest person in the room. That seat became possible because others had made, many great sacrifices for me to do that. So I reflect upon, the people who paved the way. And then I sort of embrace, the visibility that what being a first means. And I do take that, as a serious position to be in. And so I try to use my platform, not just to give back, but to amplify those things that I care about, those things that can help, my country. Obviously, here at the exchange, we worked on with a number of our councils, helping our companies solve for things, like when we created our board diversity advisory council to have there be more diverse members on corporate boards. Part of that was out of a need to be a resource for our companies and to do it in a problem solving way, as opposed to, we didn't want to do a mandate or any sort of hard rule that way. We sort of tapped, where the resources were, which were the CEOs, to ask them, like, who would you nominate who would be board ready? And, from that kernel of an idea from 2019, when we had, 20 or so CEOs come up with 45 people, that database is over 1,000 people today of diverse candidates and women who are board ready, who a CEO will stand behind. And so part of it just, me, I used my role in that seat to be able to create something, that solved for something, which is really important. And then I tell anyone who's ever been a first, I mean, your biggest job is to make sure that there's a second, to make sure that you are paving the way for that next generation, that you have, you're grooming to be able to pass the baton to that next generation. So, that's also part of the giving back and making sure, if you're the first and there's not a second, then you've kind of wasted that seat, in my opinion. So, your biggest role, I think, is to make sure you're in that seat, to make sure that there's a second and a third and a fourth.
Yeah, I remember reading the book Legacy by James Kurtz about the All Blacks, and he said you should always be leaving the shirt in a better place than you inherited it. So it's always about that incrementalism, raising the bar. And as I listen to you, there's so much impact that you've created. You talked about that those 1,000 diverse candidates who are seen as board ready, and I'm curious here. Do you ever take a moment? Just not to pat, but it is to pat yourself on the back, just to be like, you know what, I'm making a difference. Like, do you ever celebrate those moments and acknowledge the contribution that you've made in making that possible?
I do. I really do. And again, I can sort of see it in what my mentees do, what they go on to do. I see it, from this student that junior high school we adopted in Harlem, and, creating a pre-law curriculum for those students, from, one of those students going on to become a lawyer. Yes, I see it in really tangible ways and it, affecting people's lives. So yes, I get to celebrate those moments because I get to see sort of what happens, when, you have a good idea and it grows. And not all my ideas are great ideas. But the ones that have legs, that are growing today. The organizations, adopting a high school, providing for the principal for a day program to be able to ring the bell to celebrate a milestone for the creation of that entity and for others. So I get to pay it forward and come full circle in that sense. So um, to celebrate in many different ways. So yes, I do.
It's so important, isn't it? Because I think many people can live in the world of nexting. We create impact in the world and we're straight onto the next thing. And it isn't the absence of moving on to the, more goals, having greater impact, but it's also just taking that moment. And I think the world is moving so fast. It's intentional, just pausing, just to reflect.
It's interesting. I just relayed that message to one of my colleagues here at the Exchange because we're always looking to be better and to do better. I said, sometimes we need to pat ourselves on the back too. Yes, we should be celebrating all of our successes. And you're right, there is this tendency to say like, okay, we got to keep moving on. But to pause, to say, and to reflect on the things that you have achieved and all of our successes. And it's so easy to dwell on what didn't go right. But how much more powerful it is to dwell on what went right and what it feels like when things go right. It tends to repeat itself when you do that, I think.
I remember interviewing a fantastic CEO, and I think it's when they hit 100 million users. I think it was 100 million, which was a milestone. I said, what did you do to celebrate? He said, we stopped for 2 minutes and had a piece of cake. But they still, nonetheless, because he said, look, if you stop, like the world is moving, it's moving on. And it was still 2 minutes of let's have a piece of cake, all of us together. Let's, this is a milestone. Let's be porous. Let's just bathe in this for 2 minutes, and then it's back to work.
I think it's important. I really do. Really important to do that. Celebrate the good. Absolutely. That energy is so
Always
important.
Celebrate the good.
Really important.
I think so. It's infectious. It's, it creates a ripple. And you've had a very distinguished career and over, several decades. And I'm wondering, our careers are never linear. It'd be wonderful if it was only ever up, but, it's zigzags and step changes. What has been, if you think about your career path, what has been an obstacle or a challenge? And it isn't about the obstacle itself, but it's like, what did it teach you? What was the lesson there?
Mm-hmm. So, wow, I've had a few. And some of them haven't really been obstacles. Just put it this way, the path has been somewhat diverted. I always give this example to people. So when, during the financial crisis, when the M&A work just dried up, there was like no M&A work. So those of us who have been M&A lawyers had to find something to do. And so decided to retool myself and then retrain myself to become a restructuring lawyer and, to learn how to buy and sell assets in bankruptcy and to help create, instruments for companies who needed funding. And, that skill set really, I think, prepared me for my first appointment as vice chair of the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, whose job it is in the event of a bankruptcy of a broker-dealer, you're there to protect the accounts of customers. And so having that restructuring background, I never would have had that background before, but for that. And I happened to have done that during my partnership year. And, one of the partners, the managing partner said to me, he goes, Sharon, you didn't need to do that the year you were up for partner. That was like a really gutsy thing to kind of do. And I said, I hadn't really thought about it. I just saw it as an opportunity to be a better lawyer and to use my time, productively. And so I always tell people that the lesson in that is it's okay to do something you've never done before. And so that obstacle of no M&A created an opportunity to learn a totally different skill set that then became, to be extremely useful. And in my being viewed as a possibility to be appointed by the president to that role. So You just never know. So you have to go for it sometimes and create those opportunities when you don't even know you're doing it.
And isn't it interesting in times of crisis or periods of extreme change? It's like this opportunity. If it's what's the mindset you're going to bring? Because I often think about challenges as waves, and it's often the bigger the wave, the bigger the ride.
Mm-hmm.
So we can choose to be knocked over by the wave, or we can choose to ride it. And doesn't mean it's easy, but it's like, how do we choose to approach it?
Yeah. That framework too, I think it changes the way you live your life as well, because again, we all have sort of personal obstacles or challenges with family members or loved ones or health issues yourself. And just, that's a skill set that comes handy in so many different ways to know how to pivot and to know when to lean in and to, to know how to, be receptive to the fact that the landscape's going to change. There's some things we can control, but sometimes we do have to, ride that wave because the other side of it, something great is going to be there. Something great is just going to be there.
And sometimes you don't know what that looks like.
Nope.
You don't know what, and hence I love what you said there. You said, I've been on not obstacles, diverted paths, but
Yes.
those diverted paths have led to the most extraordinary opportunities.
Yes, they are. They really are. And they happen throughout life. They really do. And they happen all throughout life. They're still happening today. I know there's another pathway. I'm not sure what my fourth career is going to be, but I know it's there somewhere. And maybe it'll be being that teacher. You never know. Just never know.
I think writing books, I feel like there is so much wisdom here about cascading that out into the world. And saying that, when you reflect on your career, and I know we've still got, career 4 to come,
Yep.
But what are you most proud of?
Mm. That's a hard one to answer. Gosh. I think I'm most proud of being a good friend to good friends, in that sense. From a career perspective, it would be, it was such two moments in time, it was such an absolute honor to have been a commissioner of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission at a time when our nation was grappling with, what do we do to solve for this financial crisis and not to have it. I'm just really proud of that moment in time of being a part of a solution. And then, clearly, and being the first woman, the first person of color to chair the board of the New York Stock Exchange. The significance of that was I didn't realize, what that meant to so many other people. It means a lot to me personally, but it means so much to so many people who see me in this role. And so I'm just proud to be able to sit in this seat and to inspire others.
There's so much there that I love what you shared, like, being a good friend to my good friends and the people we surround ourselves with. They're our support network. They're the platforms or the enablers for us to do our best work. And I find sometimes personally, it can be easy to neglect those relationships in the busyness of work. And actually, they are like the foundation to be able to show up as the person that we want to be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's important. I tell people it's also why, life is like a marathon. You really do have to pace yourself and you'll have ebbs and flows and different pathways and different obstacles. And so also being for friends, helping your friends navigate, their marathons. Those are lessons that I learned from them as well, and supporting them and vice versa. I mean, the support of my family, my spouse and friends. I don't sit in this chair, without that tremendous support and love and care that I've been fortunate to be surrounded with. It's made a huge difference.
Yeah, none of us is an island.
No, absolutely not.
We all need love and that stability around us. And I'm curious around, are there any mantras, quotes, that you have such a lovely way with words? I was wondering, are there any mantras through your career that have really impressed upon you?
Wow. So I would say one of the early ones was, don't let other people define you. It's, you can control not every aspect of your career, but don't let other people limit your dreams and your possibilities. Um, Obviously the sense of giving back, treating others with, respect and the way in which you would like to be treated is foundational, frankly. As well. And one of the things I learned, early on in the relationship with my husband from asking a couple who they were mentors to us was like, what's the secret to your marriage? And the response was grow together and not apart. And so when I'm asked that question, as my husband and I celebrate almost 50 years of knowing each other, that's the response I give to them is to learn how to grow together and not apart. So I think those are some of the
I
kernels.
love that. And I think the secret also to a happy marriage is keep communicating. I think when
Absolutely.
you stop talking, that's where the niggles can fester and become like way bigger. Whereas if you just get that dialogue going, but it is about growing together because we all have chapters in life, and
Yeah.
we're not the same person a decade in or 2 decades in that we were when we met. When you meet, so
Yeah.
it is that growing together is such a critical piece.
It is. It really is. So that's important.
You have the most incredible vitality. I said this when we first met. I'm like, you just bring energy and how you have such you are busy and you are impacting so many
Yeah.
companies and individuals. What are your fuel sources?
So number one, I'm an optimist. I mean, I really see the glass half full. I really do. Because I believe in tomorrow. In that sense. I believe in self-care. I'm not always great at it. I used to be even better when I used to go to the gym, but you got to invest in yourself. And when I do that is when I feel the best. And that's investing in my health. That's investing in how I look. The ways that you have to invest in yourself, so that when you you walk out the door, you feel great. That's important, and having that quiet time for yourself. Because otherwise, you're right. You get all the voices of why not to do something, or why you don't have time, or quiet time really creates that room to expand moments in time. To be honest, so quiet time is really important as well. I love quiet time too.
And quiet time or self-care, that's not time out, it's time invested, isn't it? And I
Absolutely.
think often people come in, I haven't got time to go to the gym. I haven't got time for quiet time, but it's not, it's like
It's an investment.
that's the catalyst.
Yes.
It is the investment.
Yeah. You gotta refuel. You gotta put fuel in yourself, right? You can't, you'll burn out otherwise, so that's definitely part of it, and pacing yourself and being kind to yourself, because, again, we can be our worst critics sometimes, but knowing like, okay, yeah, I'll get better at that tomorrow. I'm just okay not being good at everything all the time, all at once. So that's okay as well. Allowing yourself to know
I
that
think that
you don't have to be perfect. Good is good enough sometimes.
yeah, it is. And I think that that being kind to ourselves is where the board of directors comes in as well, because sometimes we can really beat ourselves up. We can be our own biggest saboteur, whereas your board can remind you of your brilliance and who you are. And sometimes we all need that. We can get ourselves in a funnel, and that funnel we can spiral quite quickly. So that board can also serve a really important role in those moments as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know you get to see that in your seat as well, with the companies you advise and the CEOs that you work with. And the wisdom that you impart, not just in your podcast, but in your newsletters. And I'm inspired when I read what you put out there, and you amplify, that great energy as well. So it's
Thank you.
It's important.
It is. And I think self-care, it's such an interesting one. But, our energy introduces us before we speak. And I think we often focus on the what of our jobs, the things we need to deliver, our KPIs, our objectives, but the how we be when we're doing the what. if we're showing up frenetic, frazzled, chaotic, like people are going to look at you, be like, "Are you good enough to lead?
She's a mess,
Do I
right?
trust that you're going to?" So I think and I remember my coach once saying to me, like, when it comes to exercise, some is better than none.
That's true.
So if you only get 10 minutes,
yes,
some is better than none.
That is so
And
true.
look, as we, but it is true. And as we think about, wrapping up, what are the core tenets that you live by? The pillars of Sharon Bowen.
Wow. To live one's life with integrity, with empathy, and I think a life of gratitude and service. I think that would be sort of the tenets I live by. I could probably add to that list, but I'll start with that one. Those 4.
My son was, when he was at school, one of his teachers said to him, like, gratitude is the magic carpet. And I was like, yes, it is. I said, there are so many things to be grateful for.
Absolutely.
The fact we get to wake up, we breathe, we can talk, walk, speak, and it doesn't, we don't need loads of time to be grateful. We could just spend 10 seconds looking around the room.
Absolutely.
And really just tune into what's around us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great life when you can take the time to know that's the case. Absolutely. Gratitude.
Gratitude. I'm all, and it amplifies. When we talk about energy, it raises our energy. And as we look to kind of forward look, what would be a great question that you think I could ask a future guest on? Like, what are questions you speak to your leaders to help them be reflective, in order that they can show up as the best version of themselves?
Oh, that's a tough one. My first response is going to be ask them what kind of ice cream do they like. That's a good way. That's a good icebreaker, right? Like, what kind of ice cream do you like? Are you a vanilla person or you strawberry? What's your favorite ice cream? I would start with that. Something fun.
I did a session this morning, and we did, the question we asked everyone was, what was your first ever concert you went to? Or the first ever album you bought? But I completely showcased my age, because some people have never bought an album. They've only ever lived in it was just, I think sometimes bringing in levity, bringing in lightness. We live in a world that's quite a serious place. That
Yes.
ice cream, albums, concerts, I think it is about finding the joy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good one. Absolutely. And by the way, vanilla is what I like.
So I was going to ask, okay, so did I like strawberry or vanilla or a mixture?
I like a
Vanilla,
mixture too.
And my ice cream is, it's a go-to for me, always on the dessert list. I'll always opt for an ice cream, not a sorbet, always the ice cream.
I think we're kindred spirits again.
Okay, so next time we meet, we're going to be in our bold colors and we're going out for ice cream.
Looking forward to it, Georgie. And thank you so much again.
Do you know what? This has been, I said to you before we record, I said, this is going to be the bright spot of my week. And it has lived up to that and more. So thank you for being so gracious in your sharing your experiences, your knowledge, your kernels of wisdom. And like I said at the beginning, a single insight has the ability to transform and elevate and move people into a place that they never knew that were even possible. So thank you for being that gift to me today. And thank you for being the gift to those people who will be listening to this.
Yeah. Thank you so much again, and have a good day.
Thank you, Sharon.